I'll introduce myself really quickly. My name is Tony Yang. If you're new to these webinars, Mucker Capital is an early stage venture firm. We invest in pre-seed, seed, as well as Series A. We run an accelerator program as well. My role is head of growth, which basically means I have the privilege of spending time with many of our extremely smart and ambitious and oftentimes overworked founders. So we also do these webinar sessions as a way to teach the broader startup community on various topics that are meant to be useful and educational for the community. But really, today's star of the show is our friend Rock Vitale. He is the founder and CEO of a consultancy called Easie, and they do a lot of work across different areas, but mostly I'd say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rock, they do a lot of work around AI and automation and workflows for businesses of all different sizes, including startups. So super excited to have Rock join us. Rock, thanks for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to Mucker for hosting this session. Really excited to be sharing this content with you today. So yeah, as Tony said, my name is Rock Vitale. I'm the founder and CEO of Easie, and we primarily do work in the implementation of automation and AI for different sized businesses. And so what we're sharing with you here today covers not just best practices and information about tools and what you can use, but also actual use cases that we've seen in real life and some tales from the field, if you will. And so like Tony said, definitely meant to be interactive. So if I'm talking about any of these subjects, definitely feel free to drop a question there in the Q&A box. And so we've got our agenda here today, which goes through kind of an intro, what we kind of suggest in terms of ways to think about how to implement these tools for your own business, whether you should be using them, a couple of use cases, and then going into specific tools as well as best practices and pitfalls. So really excited to share this with you today. And so just as a high level introduction, what is the goal of this session? Like I said here, it's just to give you some real world practical examples that you can walk away with looking at your own business and seeing high priority use cases that, we've seen make a huge difference. We've been in scenarios where we've seen clients take processes that go from days or weeks down to hours, and in some cases, completely automating workflows. And so different sized businesses have sort of different needs, and accordingly, there's different tools that exist. And there's things to know about when implementing these types of systems for your business. But the end result really is that you can significantly save time and reduce manual work. And when we're talking about early stage businesses, that's a critically important factor. A lot of the time people will hire a bunch of people too early without optimizing their processes, or they will have sort of unscalable methodologies for doing things operationally that lead to bottlenecks over time. And through doing this, you can get more done with less and ultimately achieve operational excellence. And I'll keep the buzzwords to a minimum during this session, but really that's what we're talking about here. Is we like to call it tech-enabled operational excellence, and that's the goal of this session. So we're going to add a poll here to the audience, but we have this checklist that you can ask yourself that we just wanted to kind of gauge the audience, see what you think, of these questions and if they resonate with you. But when we're talking about AI and automation, one of the things that you really have to think about is this necessary for what you're doing? I think a lot of the time people will want to just immediately be like, okay, let's throw AI at everything. Let's, add all this tech. Let's, make the system really advanced. But in some cases, you don't actually need to do that. In some cases, that's not necessary. And so kind of the way to think about it is asking yourself, number one, do you have repeatable time-consuming processes, things that you have to do in order to do your business activities? Are you handling a large amount of data or client input or content or unstructured data? Are you already using tools like Zapier or Make or some of those low-code tools like Airtable or Monday.com? And would automating something save you at least 5+ hours a week? Again, we're finding that some of these processes, we've seen whole teams dedicated full time to these manual activities. And so, thinking about those things. Similarly, in terms of sort of another indirect bottleneck, we've seen decentralized data that needs to constantly be manually aggregated being another sort of pain point that people have. But do you have a clean, centralized place where your data lives? Do you have a database? Is that a spreadsheet? These are all questions, that are important to consider. And so I know we've got the poll going. I don't know if I can see the poll. Oh, here we
Yep,
go.
there we go.
So yeah, everybody go ahead and take a second to fill out that poll and we'll sort of share the results there. But again, these are things that when you're looking at this for your own operation, the first thing that we suggest is to do an operational audit, which we'll talk about in the next slide in a little more detail. But you want to be asking yourself, is this something that is necessary? And what are your specific pain points, which we'll talk more about. So I don't know if I can see the results here of the poll. I just see the questions. Let me pull it up.
Yeah, I think people are still entering their choices here. Maybe we'll give another 20 seconds or so, and then Justin can close the poll. And I believe, Justin, you're able to show the results of the poll.
Right. Yep. So yeah, we'll just give everybody a few more seconds to do that. But this is sort of a simplified way to think about it. I mean, the key kind of takeaway from this is, what does your specific business look like? What are you doing that is a critically important thing, yet simultaneously is time consuming and repetitive? And in some cases, you're looking at needing to use a combination of manual and automated processes, which we'll talk more about. But a lot of these things, what you'll see is that we're not just talking about, okay, we're automating 100% of this thing. We're talking about, in a lot of cases, semi-automated systems. So really interesting results of the poll. The majority of people said that they do have time-consuming, repeatable processes. 93% said that, which is fascinating. 85% of people are handling large amounts of data and client input. About 56% are using some of those low-code tools for automation, which is interesting and cool. 96% said that automating would save at least 5 hours a week. No surprise there. And about 59% said that they have a clean, centralized place for their data. So extremely fascinating and, an obvious indicator of sort of the pain points. Furthermore, zooming in further on this, in addition to asking yourself those questions, like I was saying, you want to do an operational audit of your business. This is something that every time we're kind of working with our clients to implement these things, the first thing that we do is pre-production. We do this current state analysis and we say, okay, what is your current state and what's your desired future state? A lot of the time, when people are looking at, okay, let's implement these kinds of systems, they want to do everything all at once. They want to kind of eat the whole elephant at the same time sort of situation. And what we've seen is that if you focus more on specific pilot projects and you do it kind of one or two at a time, that can lead to significantly more results over time. You want to eat the elephant one bite at a time, if you will. And so we have this framework here for how to think about this if you're doing an audit for your own business. You want to look at this framework, which again, I'll limit the buzzwords, but we call this the easy pain point prioritization matrix. And what you're doing is the things that you want to focus on first as pilot projects is the high impact, high frequency tasks or problems, if you will. Those are the highest priority things. Obviously, sort of similarly, these low impact, low frequency problems, even though they might be exciting and interesting to maybe throw AI at, probably lower priority. Whereas sort of the high impact, low frequency, and low impact, high frequency, those are sort of medium priority. But that's sort of a simplified way to think about this. And this is all just to say, what are your hair on fire problems? We like to call them pain points, but what we found really kind of gets to the core of what we're asking is, what are those really serious problems that when I'm talking about these things, you're probably thinking about this right now. And if you will, feel free to take a second in the Q&A box to drop a hair on fire problem that you might have, or an example that may have come to mind as we're talking about this. But this is just another way of saying high frequency, high impact. So we see things like, oh, we have to run payroll for, hundreds of contractors every week for our marketplace, or, oh, we have to aggregate data across our CRM based on specific activities that are occurring outside the CRM, or we need to get data from these 50 different websites and aggregate it for analytics. These are kinds of some of the things that we see people dealing with. Another thing that comes up often is people dealing with lots of documents. So, oh, we deal with 12,000 documents per month kind of thing. So we see an example here in the audience, gathering data from field staff with specific metrics. She needs a transparent, repeatable process to gather meeting notes and company information. And that's a great example. We see that sometimes with field services teams or teams that are kind of deploying to the field and having to gather those notes, put them into a structured process. One of the use cases that we'll talk about, we'll go into more detail about that, Mass outbound communication is a pain point. That's another one that we'll actually have an example that we'll discuss. But that's one we see all the time, sort of the sales engine and the marketing and outbound activities. And then we see another person saying that they're very, very early stage and pre-launch. And so, these are great things to think about, even if you are at this early stage. Because like I said, even if you are sort of in the period before implementing this, you want to do this sort of pre-production, because setting up these systems in advance before they become a pain point is also obviously a nice thing to do. And then we got one more example here, and then I'll move on, is the death by a million paper cuts with so much menial work. Totally get that. Not one repeated process, but a series of low-skilled effort of data cutting, document creation, and other tasks that take too much time. Super, super good example from Jordan here, which really gets to the core of what we're talking about. With these kinds of systems you can set up, a lot of the time we're not talking, like I said, about just completely automating something where it's 100% of it is done, but we're talking about, hey, maybe you can take this process that is 20 clicks and take it down to 2 clicks. So even things like I send a message in Slack to a bot, and then it goes and creates a Google Slides deck, or it creates a whole document related to the data that I've put in or the keywords that I put in the message. Little things like that, where you can make the process go from 10 steps to 2 steps kind of thing. Those are huge. We see another comment here of looking to set up automated processes for finance functions. As we can see, there's a bottomless pit of hair on fire problems that these different businesses are experiencing. And I think it really gets to the core of what we're talking about here. And we've all been this guy here on the right with the hair on fire. So definitely seems like this is resonating. So let's dive into some use cases now. And we're going to go through a couple use cases. Obviously, this is not exhaustive, but these are kind of some that we've seen that are pretty sort of common between different businesses, where you're either automating finance or operations or marketing or analytics or other kind of operational activities. But we wanted to talk about financial operations first. The sort of FP&A activities is something that we see really often being time consuming, and spreadsheet tracking. And we see a comment here in the audience. I think you guys can see the screen, I believe. So I don't think, you guys can all see this, right? Still, there's no issue.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, I think Jeff might be having some issues, but it looks like we're sharing. Yeah. So anyway, FP&A use case, bottom line, a lot of people are using spreadsheets for these activities. And there's a huge amount of errors that can happen when you're using spreadsheets, and it's time consuming and it's avoidable. So a lot of time when we're talking about early stage businesses, you have people using things like QuickBooks, which we'll focus on as one of the examples, but other people use kind of more advanced ERP systems, like NetSuite, and in some cases, other systems, especially if you have a high frequency of transactions. But oftentimes too, you're using something like Stripe, especially if you're kind of like a tech company. And so having these integrations between your accounting system and your payments processing system, little things like that are kind of, I think we all sort of know about that. But there's other things you can do that, based on these triggers and actions that can occur from your operations, you can automate additional activities. So some examples that we have here are you can integrate tools with things like QuickBooks and your project management tools. So, things like Jira or Notion or Airtable. For example, if you finish a specific project or do a specific activity, you can create invoices automatically. So we've seen examples where there was a marketplace we were working with where they had to create about 250 invoices per week based on these healthcare facilities that they were working with. And they were doing that completely manually. And through the kind of completion of different sort of triggers, we were able to create those invoices automatically. Another thing you can do, which there's some interesting tools out there that we'll talk about, but you can use AI to create insights about what your business is doing financially. So a lot of the time, people just need to ask natural language questions. Your board is often asking these questions too, but you can figure out things like your burn rate, your top expenses, trends over time about these things. And there's some tools out there that you can do that you can customize a little bit, but then there's some out of the box stuff as well, which we'll show in the next slide. One thing that I know for early stage companies and portcos is board reporting. In some cases, people can spend, a few hours a week kind of creating these reports, and you can use AI and automation to speed up that process. So again, if you're using QuickBooks, they actually have what's called an API where you can generate reports automatically, and then you can put that data either through an LLM if you want it to be kind of more explained in natural language, or you could put that structured data into a report automatically. So you can do things like create a PowerPoint presentation automatically with specific slides, or create a slides deck, really create any type of document. You can create Word documents, spreadsheets, etc. But board-ready reporting is another thing you can use these tools to do. And so in this next sort of slide here for use case one, we have kind of two examples here. Number one is Intuit launched this product on QuickBooks recently, where basically they have a chatbot now that you can use within QuickBooks that you can ask natural language questions to that will give you data and sort of clickable ways to drill down. One of the things that I'll emphasize is that we're kind of talking about two things when we're doing this presentation. One is implementing these workflows yourself, where you're setting up these tools, using some of these systems that we'll go into. And then two, some of these things are just software products that out of the box, they have these sort of automation capabilities that you don't really need to do as much. It's more of a low code situation. So the thing on the left is QuickBooks, where you're seeing these QuickBooks insights where, again, you're looking at reduce expenses and they're giving you these top 3 expenses per month. And you can ask follow-up questions in natural language. It's pretty slick. They just launched that. And then on the right, this is a screenshot of Zapier, which some of you may be using, where in this case, you're using Jira, you finish a project, and then that triggers the creation of a QuickBooks invoice. So these are kind of focused examples, but you can see kind of quite clearly here how that can be useful. Furthermore, and again, I'm focusing on Intuit because that's kind of what we see a lot of early stage companies using as these sort of Intuit products, but this applies more broadly to other types of systems. Pretty much every one of these tools has an API where you can integrate with it. But QuickBooks actually has the ability to generate reports automatically as well, which you can then take that data and you can push it to other systems, or you can push it to other documents, or you can use it to sort of enrich a large language model to be able to get data specifically from your system and answer questions in more detail in a ChatGPT-like interface. So some of you may have heard of like an MCP server, and that is one kind of direction you can go in with this, but quite fascinating for sure. Use case number 2 that we wanted to discuss. We've got a couple sort of examples here on the right. That's actually me when I had long hair, when we were doing sort of some computer vision stuff. But one of the things that you can do more broadly is you can use AI and automation to speed up workflows and automate them in a way that you're sort of less manually involved in the system. So we have a few kind of examples here. Number one, a lot of you are probably using Calendly or another type of scheduling tool to interact with customers, where they're booking meetings with you, whatever, they're booking these sort of consultation events. And what you can do is when that occurs, you can automatically generate a custom agenda. You can update your CRM with the leads information. So for example, a lot of the time when people are booking a meeting with you, their email address has a specific domain for their business. So in some cases it's a Gmail, but more often than not, it's an actual business domain. You can take that domain, then you can automatically scrape the website to learn a little bit more information about them. You could push that to your sales team, which may be yourself in the early stage, and kind of speed up this sort of prospecting research and creating the agenda to what might be relevant for that person. One sort of pro tip, if you're using a scheduling tool, is to add a field to request optionally what they want to talk about in the meeting. Oftentimes people do fill that out, and that can help give a little bit more context to your system. But you can create an agenda, you can update the CRM with the context, and you can even schedule follow-up meetings in your calendar system. I think the second bullet point, sort of obligatory mention, that a lot of us are using these AI summarization tools for meetings, but these things actually are quite good for creating meeting notes and creating follow-up activities. So there's some out of the box that you can use, like Otter, for example, or even Zoom has like an out-of-the-box feature that does that. But even, with permission from your attendees, even if you just record the audio and then you transcribe it using, say, like voice memos, even on Apple, and then you just put that into an LLM, it can create a pretty good result, and that doesn't cost any money. And so really good stuff, and, more to say for sure. But the third bullet point that we really wanted to mention here that can be really powerful is auto-classifying data. And so one of the things that is a really powerful use case of AI, a lot of people just are immediately thinking about chatbots, whatever, but AI is fantastic for taking unstructured data and turning it into structured data. So you could take images, and in this case, you could see even a video stream or text, and you can classify it according to different criteria. That may be actually extremely useful. Say if you have a service that is a technology product that allows for comments or allows for users to chat with each other or allows for any sort of input from users that you want to moderate in a specific capacity. So you can see here on the right how in this case, this was like a video stream where we were sort of figuring out if there was PPE in the video stream. You can see you can use this for a manufacturing process to detect defects, which I think is sort of not as relevant to the audience here. But to zoom in on the sort of chat moderation question, here's an example of what you can get out of an AI model, where this is actually something that OpenAI offers as sort of a moderation tool, where you can put text through a system and it can tell you whether or not it's flagged for specific moderation criteria. So you can see here, is there sexual content? Is there hateful content, violence, et cetera? You have it sort of broken down into these categories where you can create a pretty slick workflow of like, do we want to flag a comment? Do we want to automatically ban a user if they say something hateful or threatening? All kinds of things you can think about that you can do with this. This is an example of categorization, but you could similarly create other categorization mechanisms that can be used, even outside of the moderation example. And in this sort of workflow, again, we're talking about, say, a software system where you let users create comments or chat with each other. A user creates a new message in your system, it's automatically added to your database. Immediately, the AI reviews the message for profanity, violence, or other inappropriate content. If the moderation flag passes, nothing else happens. But if it does pass, depending on the severity, you can create a ticket and notify the moderators to, review the comment manually. Or if certain triggers are filtered, you can suspend the user automatically and then conduct further investigation if necessary. So, you can imagine, and this is especially helpful in sort of a B2C scenario where you might have a lot of users, but you can imagine previously, the previous state for say like a Reddit or something similar was they were manually reviewing all these comments or they were using keywords. We've seen that where in sort of pre-AI systems, we had lists of hundreds and thousands of keywords that were, trigger words where you'd have a curse word and you have like the 20 different ways to spell the curse word. And it was just very time consuming and still didn't kind of touch every use case. We've seen how creative people can get with their messages and typing words with special characters and stuff. So classifying data, super helpful. I think as far as LLMs go too, all kind of the big four out there of like obviously the OpenAI and GPT sort of suite. Anthropic suite is fantastic as well, especially kind of the Claude 3.7 tool. Gemini is actually really catching up with Gemini 2.5 and the 2.5 Flash. I'll give an obligatory mention too. And then, of course, got to give our sort of credit to the open source people as well. We really like the work that Meta has done with their Llama products as well, and a lot more to say about sort of open source versus closed source. But I digress. One other thing that we really wanted to mention when you're using AI tools and you're using like AI API to interact with these systems is you can create something called structured outputs. And so what that means is that when you're talking to like a chat GPT, for example, a lot of the times they'll just give you back text. And that's not as useful if you want to use it for like an integration. So you can create what's called a structured output, which means that the response will basically come back as what's called a JSON object, where every single time the response is in this sort of structured criteria that can then be much more useful for, say, like sending the data to a CRM, sending the data to another software system, or just programmatically interacting with the data at all. So we can see an example here where there's, in this case, it was like a resume applicant where it said, my name's Sarah Johnson, I'm 34 years old, I work as a software engineer, I specialize in Python, machine learning, and cloud infrastructure. And we can see we set up the structured output here in the sort of API call to, in this case, it was OpenAI product. And then the output is in this sort of structured content, which again, if there's no data there, then it will just return as blank. There's more to say, but this is super powerful. This is something that exists across sort of large language models. And we're focusing a lot on large language models. There's also other tools you can use for like computer vision and sort of more kind of single use or like very focused use cases. But, the majority of people are talking about LLMs when we're talking about this, but obligatory mention of structured outputs because they're fantastic. Okay, next use case, employee onboarding and HR automation. So this is just to say HR can be challenging. Even if you're using contractors, it can be quite challenging and sort of time consuming to achieve compliance. Not just things like documentation, but also, actually just sort of managing payments and managing training and managing sort of other compliance activities. And in some cases, there's really good out-of-the-box systems that work. So we've seen, for example, JustWorks be fantastic for managing employees, scaling up kind of the training activities and just sort of doing these things in a more automated way. And that's an example of where sort of software as a service used in sort of a thoughtful way can be beneficial. One thing to mention too is that you can use these systems to send documents automatically when you're onboarding somebody, like I said, to do training module assignments, but then also kind of in a more custom way, you can integrate chatbots into, say, your Slack instance to answer employee questions. And so one of the things that really is the use case that we see quite often is that when you onboard a person, they're constantly asking their manager new questions. They're constantly asking questions, hey, what should I do? XYZ. And you can achieve a huge amount of sort of time savings with a trained chatbot that answers those questions. So like an FAQ chatbot that's internal, if you will. And so to show some screenshots of that, we've got JustWorks here. Again, no affiliation with JustWorks, but we've found that JustWorks is fantastic. There's other tools out there that you can use for HR compliance as well. But this one we found is a little more affordable for early stage companies. And then a screenshot of what a sort of Slack bot might look like for a new employee. Because again, oftentimes they're asking questions like, what's our vacation policy? Where's the coffee machine? How do I submit a timesheet? These things that are kind of, easy to answer, et cetera. But, chatbot, hugely helpful and relatively easy to set up, especially with some of these tools that we're going to show you. Okay. Another use case that we want to zoom in on
Hey, Rock, if I could ask a question from the audience related to the onboarding use case. So Laura asked that she said that she's been using Scribe to do a piece for new hires. Where should she store them, in Notion or Google Drive? Any comment there?
Good question, Laura. And I would say that if you're using Notion extensively and you're creating these SOPs, I would save them there in wikis. And so we found that Google Drive is more kind of for files that you're using for kind of project work or sort of operational work, as opposed to these files that you're using that are kind of references for employees that you might want to supplement with text or more descriptions. I would use Notion for sure. Another similar tool that we found is really helpful for that is Confluence, which is like a Atlassian sister product to Jira. But a great question. Yeah, for sure. And then use case number 4, this zooms in a little more on the HR use case, which, again, I think there's a lot of different examples, but especially when you're in an early stage company, you're using contractors quite a bit. And if you have any sort of like marketplace where we've seen this before, we worked with a company that was doing, it was like an Uber-like system, but for healthcare workers, where they were working with facilities, healthcare facilities, as well as like a bunch of healthcare workers. And it was like an Uber-like interface, but they were having to pay, thousands of contractors every week and also create these invoices. And so there's tools that you can actually use to send payments to people automatically, where you either schedule them to send in the future after a trigger event, say a shift ends, for example, or you can schedule them to send in real time. And these tools can handle tax compliance as well as managing sort of documentation around these things. And so the tool that we're talking about here is called Branch. And books can do this as well to a sort of extent, but Branch we found is really fantastic for these tech-enabled systems. And so I have an example here where this is something that we set up in AWS, which we'll zoom in on these tools in much more detail. But in this case, since this was a more high volume use case, we picked AWS as opposed to using like a Zapier or something. But you can see here, we have an API gateway set up that triggers this Lambda function, which we'll talk in much more detail about what that means. And then we have some code written in Python that actually makes the API call, uses environment variables for the sensitive information. And this is all managed in AWS. So we'll talk a lot more about what those tools are momentarily. The other use case that we want to focus on is kind of the final use case. Great question from Jacqueline in the audience about sort of sales and cold calling, cold sort of outreach, which we'll touch on here. But one of the things that I think lots of early stage companies are thinking about that is sort of really important to consider is that outbound is just a huge part of sort of your go-to-market strategy, especially when you're in the early stage, when you're not having word of mouth growth, where there's a few things you can do. First of all, you can use AI and automated tools to get leads, to either enrich your leads or to even find the data in the first place. So we see Zoom info get thrown around a lot as something that people need in this case, but we found that that's a really expensive solution. We found it's $12,000 to $15,000, and it's just not necessary compared to if you use something like Apollo or if you use something like Clay, if you want to enrich the data further. And LinkedIn Sales Navigator to a lesser extent, but we've again found that can be kind of expensive. But you can use these tools to generate leads, to generate these lists of leads, generate their emails. You can also, as you're enriching the data, use a tool like Clay or use some of these automation tools we're about to talk about to generate these personalized messages using LLMs to be customized to the context, to the pain points, or to other data you can use as sort of signals of intent. So this is something that we do a lot, though, where it's like, okay, you see this company just got Series A funding. That's an intent signal that you could use to then reach out to them and say, hey, we saw you just got funding, XYZ pitch. And you can send that in an automated email sequence. And we'll show you a screenshot of that in the next slide, but sending automated sequences using email tools like SmartLead or Instantly are super helpful because you can have the follow-ups be sent automatically, and it looks like it's you sending it and you're configuring it to send from one of your email addresses, but it really cuts down on that time of sending follow-ups. And oftentimes that second or third follow-up is what really gets somebody to respond. We've seen huge sort of results from that. Obligatory mention to PR and public relations for using these tools around that. I think something that's slept on in early stage companies, which we really emphasize people should do, is public relations. So get a lead list of journalists, find the journalists, use GPT deep research even to do this, send press releases to journalists using these tools, and you'll be surprised how many people will write about you. We actually got a client to the Wall Street Journal and they got 8 million views in one day, and that led to significant growth for them. And they ultimately got featured on LinkedIn News. That was just because we emailed a press release to a journalist. And you can use these automated tools to do that. So this is a screenshot of what SmartLead looks like. We like SmartLead better than Instantly. We found that it's just slightly a better tool, but they're pretty much the same thing. So this is a sequence where you've got your first email. And again, you have to personalize. You have to do show me, you know me, where you're 5 to 8 times more likely to get a reply if it's personalized. And so you see we've got these placeholder variables for the subject line as well as the email itself. You got the first email, then you have it automatically waiting for 6 days or whatever, and then you're following up. And you can make this much more granular where you're sort of focusing on use cases. There's some products, by the way, to answer Laura's question from Twilio that you can also use to do this for cold calling, which are helpful as well. And Twilio has some good stuff out of the box that can do this. So this tool, by the way, again, is SmartLead. And if you pair that with Apollo and Clay, it's quite good. So now going into tools and sort of wrapping up into the kind of tools and best practices, we're going to mention 4 here that are kind of the best ones for you to know about. Zapier is number 1. We found for early stage companies that aren't dealing with huge volumes of data, Zapier is really good. It's a low code tool. And it's better for kind of like basic automations, just sending data from point A to point B, but it can get quite expensive. Make is a little bit better for more complex workflows and integrations, but again, it's sort of a higher volume. It can be expensive, and it's also a low-code tool, which has this sort of visual editor. N8N is another one that's kind of hot on the scene. They have a cloud option, but then they also have a self-hosted option, which is like an open source tool. It can be a little bit complex, and especially on the cloud-hosted version, it can be expensive. And the self-hosted option we found can be a little bit unnecessarily complex compared to the final option here, which we love, which is AWS Lambda. Lambda is fantastic because it's a serverless automation tool for developers that gives you maximum customization and low cost. It's got an extremely generous free tier of 1 million invocations per month. And you'll see in a second that it just kind of kills the competition in terms of what it looks like. But AWS also has a low-code visual editor that's sort of slept on called AWS Step Functions, which is literally just Zapier, but it's like 99% cheaper. So Zapier, Make, and N8N are getting a lot of attention, but it really, most of these are just AWS Lambda with an interface on it. And again, we have no affiliation with any of these tools, but this has just been our experience from the field. So we're just going to do a quick sort of exercise here where this is an example of if you have a lot of volume, like I was saying, say this is an automation heavy system where you have 3 million task invocations per month, say like syncing CRM updates or processing real-time data or triggering alerts across platforms and tools. Maybe you're doing something like automatically scraping legislative text and analyzing it with an LLM, for example, which we've seen. There can be huge cost implications between these tools. So if you're doing 3 million task invocations with Zapier, you're looking at about $10,000 per month cost. Extremely expensive. Make, similarly, about $2,000 to $3,000. N8N actually has a similar cost to Zapier and Make if you're on the cloud option. If you're doing self-hosted, which again, pretty complicated, unnecessarily complicated, we would assert, because you have to use Docker, you have to use other sort of tools where you're putting up a server like Railway. And again, you're still spending like $200 a month, and it could crash, and it could deal with much more complexity around failure handling, retry mechanisms, etc. AWS Lambda, $1, less than $1. There's a little bit of nuance here where it's, A, it's based on the amount of memory you allocate to each function, and B, how much time each function is spending running. But you're looking at $1 to $5 maximum with the free tier, where again, you're getting 1 million invocations per month, and then every other million invocations is only 20 cents. So it's just dramatically cheaper, but it does require a little bit of coding knowledge, but it's really, really nice. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we wanted to kind of just create this graph here before we wrap up with best practices. On the spectrum of these things, Zapier and Make are kind of the least complicated, but they're the most expensive. And again, if you have low volume, it might be clean. But even with Zapier, we've seen people, if you even run 15,000 runs per month, you're looking at $800 to $1,000, just very expensive compared to what would be probably free on Lambda. N8N, more expensive, arguably more complex. Lambda, less complex than N8N, and dramatically lower cost. So we are huge advocates for all of these tools, but we primarily, for what we're doing, use Lambda, even though it requires a little bit more coding knowledge and AWS. Just to mention too, Google Cloud and Azure do have these types of tools as well. They have kind of their own versions of these. So one more thing I want to mention about Lambda is this is a design pattern that can be really helpful, where if you use something called standard queue service, which is another AWS tool, you can make it so these are very fault tolerant systems where you can scale up to thousands or millions of runs and not have any issues with data loss or Lambda being sort of at maximum capacity. These systems are built to work together so that they can run in a way that auto scales, where you don't have to handle sort of, say I get a huge spike of data all of a sudden. Like, you can handle it using this sort of SQS to Lambda kind of functionality. And so this is a really approachable and scalable design pattern. And as a fun fact, SQS was one of the first tools that AWS actually ever created.
Hey,
All
Rock,
right.
we have a question from the audience about AWS Lambda. The question is, when you mention AWS Lambda, are you talking about invoking a headless browser in Lambda using Puppeteer?
Great question, Brian. And Puppeteer is one framework that you can use within AWS Lambda for web scraping. There's a few out there. Beautiful Soup is another one. You can also use Selenium, which is fantastic. One thing I will say is that if you're doing web scraping using a headless browser, you sometimes have to create a Docker image, where there's a little bit kind of more complexity that goes into that, where you have to make kind of the WebDriver match the Lambda compute environment. So people can get tripped up a little bit on that with web scraping, but 100% that's a use case that you could use for Puppeteer. I should also mention too that Lambda is sort of programming language agnostic. So a lot of people use either Python or JavaScript for it, but you can use other programming languages as well as a Docker container, or a Docker image, I should say. Great stuff. So just to wrap up here before we go into Q&A, best practices for implementing automation. Like we said in the beginning, do an audit of your operations and identify repetitive tasks that can be automated. Look for those hair on fire problems, AKA the low-hanging fruit. Prioritize integrations. So if you are using existing tools, even these out-of-the-box things like Notion and even Gmail, make sure that they're working well together before automating workflows. So if you're doing any sort of manual entry, you can likely eliminate that. We've seen systems where we've implemented them and it reduces manual entry by 99%. So prioritize reducing manual entry as much as possible. Focus on scalable solutions. So again, think about bottlenecks. Try to make it so you can scale in sort of this exponential way instead of having to add people to the system, which again, you see very often in these sort of tech companies. And then test and optimize. Make sure you test the system before you go live. Huge emphasis on QA. Have a development environment and a production environment that you have separate. Don't operate on your actual data if you're testing. And just regularly review and refine the automated processes to improve efficiency. Side point, feel free to do additional research on operational excellence. Look up what things like a Kaizen event are, or a Gemba walk. And those are ways for kind of continuous improvement where you can encourage everybody within your organization to be a participant. And then finally, a couple pitfalls to avoid, and then we'll go into Q&A. Avoid overcomplicating things. We're big on the philosophy that perfection is not achieved when there is nothing more to add, but rather perfection is achieved when there's nothing else to take away. And so that's a famous quote, but keep the system as simple as possible. Don't overcomplicate it. It's easy to create a workflow in Zapier that has 100 steps and feel like you're, in the lab and you're coding and it works and it's cool. But it might not be necessary. And it can create tech debt, which is actually kind of hard to maintain, especially if you don't document how it works. Make sure that you're implementing automation in sort of consistency with what your actual business needs. So again, you don't need to throw AI at everything. Some of these things are just traditional automation, like we're saying. You don't need to do an ultra technical solution if you're not there yet in terms of scale. I know someone in the audience was saying they're sort of pre-operational, pre-revenue. You don't always need to do these things. And we actually resonate with the sort of founder mode philosophy of do things that don't scale at first, do things to kind of build out your process and, get the ball rolling, and then you can focus on optimizing later. So you don't want to over optimize. A lot of people will build these complicated tech systems. They're trying to recreate Meta or Amazon or, sharding and having to handle millions of users when it's just overkill for what you're doing. If your latency is, 3 seconds instead of 2 seconds, it doesn't matter at the early stage, as long as it works and you're getting things accomplished. Obligatory mention to security. There's a whole webinar we could do on cybersecurity and how to implement that, but things like environment variables, keeping your API keys under control, doing principle of least access with your data, including things like documentation, and just making sure that employees are trained on sort of basic cybersecurity things, as well as configuring your Google Workspace or Microsoft instance to have sort of cybersecurity tools built in. And then this final point that I really think is understated, a lot of people underestimate employee buy-in. So oftentimes with technology systems, the hardest part can be getting the people involved in the business to actually adopt it. And so making sure that you involve people early, making sure that they feel like their voices are heard, making them feel like they're not just being forced into a new system, that can really help. When people are not blindsided by these things, they're much more likely to adopt them. But still expect some resistance, especially if these are like deeply ingrained processes. We see that more in the mid-market and less so in the early stage where you can move fast and embrace change. But make sure people have their voices feel heard. All right, cool. So I think we're at about the 10 mark.
Great. There's a couple of questions that I do want to bring up. And for those of you who are still with us, if you have any pressing questions, do enter them in now. Let me just go through a couple of these, not necessarily in order they came in, Rock. I'll take the first one because it's related to Mucker Capital. There was a question about whether or not Mucker Capital offers certain products to portfolio companies. If you are a Mucker portfolio company, we do have a program where we've negotiated partnerships and discounts and special offerings with various partners. Some of them come to mind are Anthropic. You could get additional credits through us with Anthropic. Same thing with ChatGPT. There's a few, AI SDR agent tools out available through our perks program. We even have one of our portfolio companies that's an alternative to Clay, which helps with, collecting and enriching data. So definitely, if you are a Mucker portfolio company, go check out the perks section within the founder portal. If you don't know where that is, reach out to me or someone on our team and we'll find out for you or help you navigate. Okay, so I got that one out of the way. These rest are for you, Rock. So one of the questions that came in earlier around your use case about FP&A was what constitutes high frequency of being worthy of being automated? Processing 10 invoices a month, 100, 1,000. What's your take on whether or not it's worth it to invest in some sort of automation process?
Great question, Lewis. And I would say, within creating invoices, there is sort of a sub point to be made, which is that some invoices are simpler than others. So in cases where you have kind of a itemized invoice where, say, you've got a bunch of different line items and they're based on specific data, then it can be really time consuming to create an invoice. If it's literally just you're sending a one line item invoice to 10 people, frankly, it still might be worth considering automating that if it's based on a trigger. If it's based on just pure services, then I probably would maybe wait a little bit more than 10. But if it's something that you could tech enable, you could use like a Zapier to do the 10 invoices per month, and that would be relatively straightforward. If you're getting into the 10, 20, higher than that range, I would definitely start looking at automating it. But again, if it's based on something predictable, so that sort of time consuming, repeatable process where it's okay, every month I have to create these 10 invoices for these 10 clients or whatever, that's more the signal as opposed to the volume. But if you start getting up to deeply itemized or higher numbers, then if it's not repeatable or if it's not currently in a state that you can predictably decide when to do it, then I would look into maybe optimizing the process more and saying, if I'm creating 100 invoices every month, how do I standardize this so that we can automate it? But just to really emphasize, even at those low volumes, that's a signal like maybe I could use a Zapier and get away with it without spending, getting a second mortgage on my house. But then when you're getting up to the higher numbers, that's when you use the more advanced tools.
Yeah. Did you want to add to that? No. Okay. So let me ask a question that wasn't in this Q&A, but I get asked a lot of this question a lot from some of my portfolio companies, which is related to your use case number two around auto classification of data. But the use case is around hiring. And sorry to put you on the spot, Rock, but that's why you're here as an expert. So the use case is many of our early stage startups, the founders are doing everything, including hiring and recruiting. They don't have the means to go and bring on a recruiter because the recruiting fees are way too out of the reach for them. And so a common use case is they post on LinkedIn and they get hundreds of applicants for a hire. They don't have a founder does not have time to review hundreds of resumes. How would you think about using any sort of AI tool to auto classify or to even pre-screen some of these resumes that come in so they could shortlist the best candidates? Do you have any thoughts of how you would approach that?
Great question, Tony. And I think that, this is something that we often think about as well. And we're in this kind of interesting scenario as a society where you've got AI applying to jobs. These jobs where you get 900 people applying to a job in the first hour, they're largely AI generated applications. And then on the other side, what we're kind of alluding to here is you have AI reviewing the applications as well, and you've got kind of AI talking to AI. But what's interesting is one thing that we've seen that can help get more qualified applicants is to put some type of question on the application that requires more of kind of like a comprehensive human answer, or requires solving a problem of some sort, or just kind of answering a question in a way that's deeper than just submitting your resume. So for example, if you're looking for a data scientist, asking them about what their SQL query would be, et cetera. But what I would say is that you can set up a system, like, again, if you're talking about a low volume of applicants, you could set up like a Zapier instance where if somebody fills out the application form, then it automatically pushes the resume to, say, a Google Drive. You could pass that file through like a Chat GPT to then classify it and then put it into, say, Notion or another one of your sort of workflow management tools. And you could have a scoring criteria based on the analysis that it does. But I would use that kind of workflow where, again, it doesn't have to be crazy. It's literally just when the application hits, take the questions, take the resume, operate on them with an AI model, and then classify them according to a scoring metric, and maybe add some sort of qualification or like a qualifier, like categorization, et cetera. But that can be really helpful as well. If you want to set up something even more advanced, you could even put like a chatbot in place, but that would require like a little more configuration where you could ask it questions about the resume and stuff. But yeah, that's probably what I would suggest. And it's okay, for a job posting, you don't necessarily have to use like an Ashby or like Indeed to actually have the application. Even though a lot of these do have APIs, you could even set up just like a form on your website that then pushes to one of your systems.
Great ideas. Okay, so there are three questions that came from the audience that are related to the sales use case. So I'll just kind of summarize these questions together, which is one, are there certain tools that you feel like are better? I know you brought up Smart Leads as in your opinion, a better alternative to Instantly. Someone asked about Seamless AI, and then more specific question around, are there ways to automate interactions such as a reply to an outbound email message? So that's all bundled in together into the sales use case. Any thoughts on, general tools and whether or not there is a tool that can answer that last specific question on automation of replies?
Yes, and great questions all around. And, this is a really high frequency use case that we see where people want to implement these marketing and sales automation systems. So first of all, a lot of the time you're using like a combination of tools. So what we found for lead gen that's best is Apollo, where Apollo is pretty cheap. It's like $50 a month, and you can get like quite a lot of contacts out of it that way. You can, compared to Seamless, which we haven't personally used Seamless, but it's sort of like an Apollo competitor. You see a lot of these sort of lead list tools out there that exist. We think that Apollo is really good. Clay is good as well, but it's just a little more expensive. And you can reduce your cost of enrichment with Clay if you do what's called bring your own key, which is like you can set up your own sort of API keys within that system. If you're trying to enrich data, Clay is considered one of the good ones. But like Tony mentioned, there's other competitors. Like you mentioned there's a Mucker Portco that is a competitor as well. But Apollo is really good for kind of the initial data. And again, you can operate on that data even without Clay using an LLM based on kind of just the data you can get out of that. If you then, for cold emails, you push that data to Smart Lead or Instantly, which frankly, they're both good, but Instantly, we found that their warm-up pool is not as good. You want to warm up any email addresses that you're sending, and Instantly is just a little more expensive while also simultaneously being more of like a, for lack of a better word, like childish interface. Smart Lead is really good. Both of them have this capability though called subsequences, where if somebody replies, you can then put them through what's called a subsequence, where you can then reply automatically to get them to say book a meeting or get them to do XYZ call to action. That's really important because the faster you reply to people that reply to you, the faster you can get the meetings or whatever your call to action is. But put them through a subsequence. There's other things you could do that are a little more kind of customized. Like if they send an email, you could set up like a Zapier trigger to then do something else. But subsequences are quite fantastic for that. And again, on the voice use case, you do see some competitors coming out that are offering like kind of expensive things for making cold calls. But there are tools you can use coming out of Twilio that you can use for making these cold calls kind of more automatically.
Excellent. Great. And then Mucker, we do have quite a bit of content and materials on that specific use case of sales automation. So if there are further questions, do reach out to me if you're a Mucker Porco and we'll guide you to the right resources. All right, final question, and then we'll need to wrap it up because we are at the top of the hour. Last question is around the very last thing that you brought up at the end of your presentation, Rock, which is how do you build a culture of having your team members be open and encourage them to use automation and AI?
That's a good question. I think, it's something that we hear all the time. I think making people feel like their voices are heard is a really big part of like getting buy-in. Helping people understand this sort of culture of continuous improvement is everybody's responsibility. I think empowering people at any stage of the organization to say like, hey, I'm doing this thing, like, what if we applied automation to it, has been really helpful. When you create a culture of continuous improvement, it can make it so people not only feel empowered, but that they feel like their voices are being heard. The earlier you do that, the better. If people get really ingrained into existing systems and like are kind of stuck doing it, and there's not a culture of continuous improvement, then you kind of can achieve more resistance. But I think making it clear to people that we are trying to help you focus on the higher impact work and focus on what's actually important. That really, I think, goes a long way, along with doing things like Gemba walks, where you can sort of have a weekly or monthly sort of review of operations and KPIs to say like, hey, does anybody have any ideas? That's, once you get a little further into growth, you can do that, but make everybody feel empowered, make everybody feel like their voice is heard.
Awesome. Excellent. All right. Well, let's wrap up with final steps. So for those of you who are still with us, if you don't mind flipping to the last slide, Rock, thank you. If you do have additional questions, feel free to reach out to Rock. His email is shown on the screen here, rvitali@geteasy, easy with an IE.com at the end, or you can reach out to me, and especially if you are a Mucker portfolio company, talk to your Mucker advisor. We do these webinar sessions, these growth series sessions every month. And so we've got topics lined up for the next month or two. If there is a certain topic that you are dying for us to cover or are extremely curious about, send a request over to Justin@muckercapital.com and we'll do a little bit of research and get something lined up according to what the needs are. And then lastly, if you are an entrepreneur and are looking to join an accelerator program or just simply raise funding, definitely reach out to us at mucker.com. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Rock, for sharing your time with us and your knowledge. Deeply appreciate it. Thank you. And we'll see all of you at the next one. Thank you. Take care.